With last summer's chaos in Afghanistan still high on the minds, here's the question. When's the right time to end a military intervention? What happens after you go? 9 years after Timbuktu welcomed them as heroes and liberators, the final French troops completing their pullout from their last outpost in Mali's far north on Tuesday. No unruliness here, but also no cries of mission accomplished. The jihadist radicals that scattered when French-led forces intervened in 2013 have long since morphed into a low-intensity, hard-to-stop insurgency with raids as far away as the far north of Benin. The French drawing down, but they're not gone yet, redeploying to the city of Gao to help coordinate with UN Blue Helmets, African peacekeepers, and a Malian army that critics say, after 9 years of support and training, has proved better at staging coups than winning hearts and minds. With civilians scared and frustrated, anti-French sentiment on the rise. What to make of persistent overtures by Bamako to Moscow and the Russian mercenaries of Wagner? What to make of fresh EU sanctions against Wagner and France's warning it would review all options if the junta cozies up further to a private army accused of abuses in another former French colony, the Central African Republic. More broadly, what's Emmanuel Macron thinking ahead of a visit next Monday to Mali that happens at the outset of his re-election bid? Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about France's departure from Timbuktu, and joining us by the banks of the Niger River from the capital, Bamako, France 24 senior correspondent Cyril Payen. Good evening, Cyril.
Good evening.
Also with us, risk and policy consultant Nyagare Bagayoko of the African Security Sector Network. Welcome back to the show.
Good evening.
From Oxford University in England, Samuel Romani, author of Russia in Africa, Resurgent Great Power or Bellicose Pretender. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And from Washington, Michael Shurkin, analyst for risk consultants 14 North Strategies. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, this was the third and final of France's outposts in the far north that's lowered the flag now. Laurent Berstecker has more on that departure from Timbuktu.
Making their final preparations before leaving northern Mali for good. French Barkhane soldiers were getting ready to transfer this military base in Timbuktu, their last one in the country's north, to the Malian army.
Aujourd'hui, la force transfère le camp de Tombouctou aux forces armées maliennes.
Les populations sahéliennes, elles sont probablement un petit peu en manque d'informations. Donc c'est aussi à nous d'expliquer. Je pense qu'elles sont vécues comme un changement. Je ne suis pas sûr que ça soit parfaitement compris. L'armée française et les contributeurs européens à l'opération Takuba, qui est une composante de l'opération Barkhane, vont continuer d'agir à leur profit autrement, à partir des bases notamment de Gao à Niamey.
The departure of French troops has left local populations divided. In Timbuktu, where armed groups continue to regularly carry out attacks, many fear this will lead to a security vacuum and further fuel the spiral of violence.
Je crains fort que si Barkhane parte et qu'il y a des trucs ça, je le crains et je l'ai à l'esprit. Je ne peux pas dire que si Barkhane part, que je resterai tranquille ou non. Moi, ce que j'avais dit, si Barkhane part, on va voir ce qui va se passer après. Après, peut-être, on va souhaiter qu'ils reviennent encore, on va les appeler.
And while others seemed to welcome Barkhane's departure, few were willing to do so on record. In the village of Tassakan, at the heart of the Timbuktu region, residents have been left to fend for themselves for years. Many feel they've been completely abandoned by the state.
Ici, il n'y a pas de réseaux sociaux, il n'y a rien, on est au courant de rien, quoi. Que Barkhane connaît le terrain, on ne connaît pas les conséquences s'il quitte, on s'inquiète vraiment. Bon, à Tassakan, ce que nous attendons la paix.
Barkhane's departure means guaranteeing population safety in the north is now a priority for Malian authorities, a daunting task in a country where armed groups control nearly 2/3 of the entire territory.
So Cyril Payen, in that report, we see the French military handing over to the Malians, and we hear the worry of the local population does the French departure from the far north leave a power vacuum?
Well, at least as far as these three outposts or bases are concerned, we were 1 month ago in the most advanced outpost in this northern Mali, in Tessalit, which is located a few dozens kilometers away from the Algerian border. And well, we have been here while the transfer from the French military, the 200 or so last soldiers were evacuated to Gao and transferring the base to their counterparts from Mali and also the United Nations peacekeepers in Mali. And well, just having a look at this very remote and isolated base on the Algerian border, surrounded by mountains, and by what were saying to us the French soldiers, who from some of them have spent 6 or 7 months on this base. It looked like very much they were living and abandoning to their fate the people living around, because very frankly, when we have been seeing this transfer of power and seeing some very ill-equipped Malian army and soldiers coming into the base, it doesn't look like they couldn't even defend the base, and it's not very easy to think that and to understand this situation. Also, it was very much of the record in the French military mind when they were leaving. They have been training this FAMA, the Malian soldiers, for months, and it looked like very much they will maybe have to come to the rescue sooner or later, but by their own and by the local population concerned, it looks like the north, and this is a huge and vast piece of land in this region. I'm very far from here in Bamako. Mali is the biggest country in West Africa, so it's a huge area, and it looks like very much. And to finish, it's really very much what is in the mind of the very people in Bamako when we talk about this reshaping of the French military intervention in Mali. By leaving the north, it looks like very much they are isolating more the north and leaving the local population to their own fate.
Niagari Bakayoko, at the outset, I asked, the question after Afghanistan, when is the right time for an occupying force or for a foreign intervention to end? And listening there to Cyril, there's that possible scenario that it could actually be not Afghanistan but Iraq, where the French pull out from the far north but are forced to come back. Your thoughts on what we've just witnessed this week there?
I think that what we are witnessing today is in fact clearly a strategic defeat, which can be presented as a reshaping of the military French presence in the Sahel. But in fact, we can see that there has been absolutely no real impact on the global security environment. We can see that every month, every year, the situation has been worsening, in particular the situation of civilian populations, which today are not considering that the French presence can be seen as a guarantee. It can also be seen as a kind of risk, and it is where we can see that there is what I'm calling a defeat, because in terms of perception, I think that France has lost a lot in this intervention.
There's no good way to withdraw, it's been said, for an army, Michael Shurkin. In the case of the French here, is it the right move, cutting their losses and saying, well, we're going to rely more on drone technology? You heard Cyril at the outset describe just how vast and rugged that terrain is in the north.
Well, please keep in mind that while the French are leaving northern Mali, they're still staying in central Mali and basically, I guess you could call it southern northern Mali, the areas around Gao, Menaka. So the French military is still staying in place, they're just not in the north. And this corresponds with the fact that the epicenter of the fighting has actually shifted to the south. So Kidal and Timbuktu and Tissalit have lost their relevance or lost their importance with respect to the larger fight, which isn't to say that there's not a security problem up there, but it also makes sense from a point of view of how best to use one's resources, that there's a very strong argument to be made for France to realign its forces and to shift its attentions more to the south and more towards the borders with Niger and with Burkina Faso, which is absolutely what they're doing. With respect to the north, I mean, part of the reality is that Barkhane's always been too small. And this is also the problem. I mean, the French have known this, and I don't know if the Malians have necessarily understood this either, that when you talk about 5,000 soldiers at its peak, 5,100 for Barkhane, that was always far too few for an area of that size, particularly with the kind of conflict where one has to occupy land and control populations and patrol heavily so that you're not abandoning large swaths of population to their fate. But they've always had to because there've never been enough soldiers there. So, you know, you could call this making the best of a bad situation, but it's never pretty, and I suspect that security in Timbuktu and Tissalit and Kidal is going to get a lot hairier, and also one shouldn't have any illusions about the ability of the Malian government to try to fill a security vacuum. Everything's going to rely on some combination of MINUSMA, the UN, or some of the local players who won't be the Malian state, and I think that's a real problem.
And there have already begun to be side deals, as we heard in that report at the outset. Side deals between some of these militant groups and civilians, and there's also a lot of frustration over the fact that, as Niagale was saying, the killings have continued, the attacks have continued. Last month, angry crowds blocked a French military convoy headed for Gao from the coast. From Ivory Coast. It was going through to neighboring Burkina Faso. It was amid outrage over a string of insurgent attacks in Burkina Faso, like the one that killed 49 local military police. The anger fueled by false rumors relayed over social media that the French military was somehow aiding the jihadists. Now, the convoy eventually did make it to Gao, but only after several stoppages. Now, with the pullout of the French from the far north, France 24 went and asked ordinary citizens in Bamako and Ouagadougou what they thought.
Every time there is an attack, they try and help us. But each time we just can't understand the international community's inability to help.
Mali is under threat from all sides. The Malian army won't be able to protect the entire Malian population. That just won't be possible.
As Malian students, all we ask is that the war in the north become a nightmare of the past.
Samuel Romani, your thoughts when you hear those comments?
Well, I think that the Malian army is obviously not going to be able to really completely protect the population over in that area, because for a variety of reasons. Not just the fact that there is the track record of instability that we've seen with 2 coups, but also the fact that this whole issue has become something of a cross-border transnational problem. The problem is also hitting into Burkina Faso. It's also hitting into Niger. And we've seen that with the death of 51 people in early August. We've seen that over the past, recent attacks on peacekeepers last week. And if it's not going to be the French, and if it's not going to be the Malian army, then who is going to really be able to take and fill the gap? It's not going to necessarily be a prospect of diplomatic solutions between different rebel groups, because when you're looking at it, you're seeing Islamic clerics in Mali effectively using their own legal systems and not really engaging with political institutions. So those local agreements are also not going to work. That leaves the Russian Wagner Group, and that leaves the Europeans, in particular Britain, which has been seizing ISIS suspects and launching anti-ISIS attacks for the first time since 2014, to take the lead. But that's not going to make up for it either. So I think that the atmosphere of insecurity that we saw in that video, and that's been reflected in the conversation so far, is very real. And the French withdrawal will just make it worse.
And about the anti-French sentiment, your thoughts on that?
So with respect to the anti-French sentiment, I think that there's been a long-standing belief within Mali that the French were not really there entirely for counterterrorism, but they were also there to effectively seize resources, so whether that be uranium, whether that be gold. And that has been amplified quite significantly by anti-French media and anti-French information spheres, mainly backed by Russia and to a lesser extent backed by Turkey. And the Russians have capitalized on that too in order to engage their support for the entry of the Wagner Group. We saw protesters during both coups were holding Russian and Chinese flags, not really because they were enamored with Russia or China, but because they were viewing that as a way of thumbing their nose at the French. And the Russians claim that there are 2 million Malians who launched a civil society petition against France, and that was what drove the entry of the Wagner Group into negotiations. That's unconfirmed, but there are substantial anti-French sentiments on the ground, reflected by that broader security problem.
Have you been feeling that firsthand, Cyril Payen, that anti-French sentiment?
Well, it's quite spreading here. Very frankly, there was this very big shock, and also for the French army with this convoy you were referring. It was the 32 a convoy of this kind coming from Ivory Coast and going to Gao through Burkina Faso and Niger, and it has been quite a shock. I was myself with the Foreign Legion soldiers in Gao, the very same who were at this convoy, so I've been able to talk to them, and they haven't. I mean, never happened in 8 years to have this first in Burkina Faso, in Terra, these huge demonstrations where people were just stopping the vehicles, harassing the soldiers, the local soldiers too, and also having some Russian flags. So a very weird situation for soldiers which are located in Gao or in up north to be harassed like this. And then when they crossed to Niger, they thought it would be okay. And in Kaya, which is a quite remote place in the three borders area, it went very violent and nasty, because we have been able to watch the footage from the French army, and it was very much coordinated attacks, and then 3 dead and many casualties, on many people injured on the ground. So this is new. It came as a shock, and maybe something which revealed a situation on the ground. Now it's frankly it's very difficult to quantify, to know exactly what is the sense or the strength of this anti-French sentiment. In Bamako, where we have been here for a few days, we have been experiencing 3 days on the row with anti-French demonstrations. Not every day very big, but consistent, which is quite new. Then there is also this, just to go back to what was said before, also the sense for the vast majority of people in the Sahel region, some misunderstanding, some confusion about seeing this big convoy of armored vehicles. Where they see a Mirage flying, they have drones, they see a lot of technology, a lot of deployment of French military personnel in the places, in the areas, and they still have people massacred, and this is even more and getting worse in the 3 borders area bordering Niger, Burkina Faso and Mali. So there is a sense also that over the fake news and the rumors, which are manipulations, whatever you call it, there is really a common sense of what are they doing? Are they doing enough? Or maybe if they're doing like this, they should leave. The problem is that everybody understands too that the military solution is not a solution, and then going to the Russians or whoever doesn't represent any solution to the mindset of the people in the streets here in Bamako or Niamey or Ouagadougou.
Well, let's talk about the Russians. First came that brewing war of words between France and Mali. Mali, after which was denounced by Paris for a second coup in a year. Then a warming of ties with the junta, between the junta and Moscow. Part of by the way, part of the current Malian defense minister's training was as an officer by the Russians. And then that recent purchase, we're seeing those images now of 4 Russian helicopters by the junta, and this open contemplation we've been talking about, the hiring of mercenaries of Wagner for training and security. Nyagade Bakayoko, the last time you joined us, we mentioned the fact that there are long-standing ties between Mali and what was then the Soviet Union. It was a country that was close to the Soviet Union when it became independent in 1960. But what's it about today? What's going on now?
What is important, in my view, is indeed to remember that Russia has always been a traditional partner of Sahel country, mostly in Mali, but this is true as well in Niger, For instance, in the speech he made just the day before what happened in Terra, President Bazoum made clear that most of the military equipment he was buying abroad was coming, in fact, from Russia. So Russia is definitely a traditional partner and not at all a new player. What is at stake today is the fact that French, in particular, is confronted to three kinds of objective on the ground. First, it is confrontation with the jihadi groups. Second, it is contestation from local populations. And the third aspect is competition with external actors, which are seen as coming in the so-called précaré, privileged area of France, and it is trying to prevent other influence. It is true, undoubtedly, that there are attempts at destabilizing the French military and political presence in the Sahel by Russia. There is absolutely no doubt about this. But there is a need also to be aware of about what was so well described by Cyril Payen, which is a kind of initial skepticism which has been growing among the population, because indeed they cannot understand why these huge disposal is not working, and then this dissatisfaction has become a deep anger. I think that what we are witnessing today is a kind of overstimatization of the international means which have been deployed, and the more modest and traditional equipment or tools that Russia has been promoted is seen as a solution by lots of population. But in my view, it will not be a solution neither.
Michael Shurkin, is what's Russia's objective? Is it like to use the old Cold War phrase, to make mischief, or are they going all in on this one?
I think the Russians are interested in making mischief. I think they're interested in sticking their fingers in France's eye. I think this also makes sense in the context of Macron's general relative hostility towards Russia, the French presence off the coast of Ukraine and support for Ukraine. But they're making mischief. There's also this aspect of Russian policy whereby Russian oligarchs are making money. I mean, Wagner's associated with what's his name?
Yevgeny Prigozhin?
Forgetting his name. Prigozhin, yes, thank you. So there's money to be made. So, like, you know, if they were to get a deal with Mali, and by the way, to date, there has been no deal between Wagner and Mali, at least as far as anybody knows, but it would be about making money. So there's some extent of just there's venality, there's a venal issue, and then there's also this aspect of making mischief. Meanwhile, for the Malian government, this is this great way to, in effect, gaslight the Malian public by saying, you know, really the source of your troubles are the French, and look at the French and ECOWAS, they're forcing us to have elections which we don't want, and you know, like they're distracting the public. I think this is just an act of gaslighting, and so I think there's a real pleasure there, and unfortunately that with some aspects of the Malian population, they have this notion that somehow the Russians would do a better job than the French, which is absurd. And I think, if anything, what the Russians would do was simply kill more civilians than the French, given their track record in the Central African Republic. And I really worry that might be seen as a feature rather than as a bug.
Right, and on Monday, we had the EU foreign ministers meeting in Brussels. They agreed to slap asset freezes and travel bans on 8 individuals involved with the Wagner Group, including its founder, Dmitry Utkin, as well as 3 energy companies linked to the group in Syria. Wagner, which has the attention of the EU, along with the junta in Bamako.
Today we adopted 2 sanctions package. First, a new sanctions regime allowing to target persons and entities obstructing the political transition in Mali. Second, We adopted sanctions against persons and entities in relation to the Wagner Group.
Samuel Romani, is this the way to handle the situation in Brussels and Paris?
Well, I think that it's not going to have much of an effect, obviously, in order to impose sanctions on the Wagner Group. First of all, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's the main figure behind the organization, has already under a wide array of individual sanctions by the U.S. Treasury Department, which extend to his mining assets as well, and also by the European Union in response to the Russian involvement in Libya. So sanctioning the Wagner Group, which is actually not an entity that you can find as a company on the internet, or you can find having a clearly transparent set of financial transactions, is probably going to have a limited deterrent effect on Russia's involvement in Mali. What it might do, however, is it might cause the Malians to pause in terms of direct engagement out of fear that they might get additional sanctions imposed against the military junta. It could have an effect on the client side, but not really from the Russian side, in my point of view. But I think that the decision that of the Malians to hire the Wagner Group is precisely because they are frustrated with the French. There's rising anti-French sentiments, and there's a belief that Russia will fight terrorism in Mali and also be able to support the autocratic ambitions of the existing junta. It'll model itself after what they've tried to do in Syria, and that those core sources of appeal will remain regardless of whether there's sanctions or not.
Cyril Payen, is there hard evidence that the Wagner Group might in fact already be there?
Well, François, this is the talk of the town, and people talk about it, and fake news are spreading all over the internet. You can see a lot of things. I was mentioning the Russian flags during the unrest over the French military convoy, but you can see people wearing a lot of Wagner T-shirts. So this is really difficult to save. Some people are pointing out some mining areas. You have a very vast mining industry in Mali, and we know that Wagner is taking money out of mining companies or mining contracts in other parts of Africa, namely in Bangui. So this is not typically the same in financially, I would say, in Mali, but it's widely rumored, without giving you any proof, that Wagner put some first steps, I would say, in Mali. It is maybe a funds contingent, but really honestly, you have
it's not confirmed. That's something that's
of helicopters or
right. It's something that's not confirmed. Michael Shurkin.
Yeah, there's no evidence that Wagner's in Mali. Also, we've been looking to see if Lobaya Invest, which is sort of the mining concern that works in tandem with Wagner, that we have no evidence that they have any presence in Mali. So thus far, it's just pure rumor and speculation. And I think, you know, both Wagner and Mali, the junta, are getting a lot out of simply that, just the rumors of this flirtation, because it's driving France to distraction. And again, it's this great classic example of gaslighting, and I think distracting the Malian public from the junta's own failures and the failures of the Malian government to really address in any serious way any of the problems that are driving the insurgencies in central and northern Mali.
All right.
But
and
so far, there's no Wagner.
So far, no Wagner, you say. The conversation's going to change drastically next week. On Monday, Emmanuel Macron is coming to Mali. The French president will, for the very first time, meet face-to-face with coup leader Assimi Goïta before some pre-Christmas time with the troops that are stationed there. Will Macron show the same sort of tough love to his hosts that he did in an October interview with French public radio station France Inter?
Public service must return with its courts, schools, with its police, everywhere, particularly in Mali and Burkina Faso. Development projects should not be stymied, otherwise, as soon as we liberate a territory, the terrorists will retake it because there are no prospects. And so the French army should not fill the void of the non-functioning Malian state. We are pivoting geographically in terms of the mission. Our focus is to strictly combat terror groups.
Yagare Bakayoko, this is a French president who's running for re-election. So is he going to be posturing when he meets the coup leader? Will it be a fruitful discussion, or will it be a photo op to show that he's tough on junta leaders and Islamists?
I think it is, in fact, a very risky decision due to the situation we have all described. I think that it will be very difficult for President Macron to make public opinion to forget all what has been said all along of the past months, both from the French and from the Malian sides. There has been a clear deterioration of the diplomatic relations. And now we can see that, in fact, all the red lines which had been imposed by France, first regarding the forbid the non-allowance to conduct negotiations. Second, the willingness of France to see the presidential election to be held in next February. And lastly, to not see any talks with Wagner. All those red lines have been overcome by the Malian authorities. And today, it is a kind of a diplomatic victory for Assimi Goïta, I would say, to see the French president to come in his own country. We are very far away from what was called almost 2 years ago at the Po summit as the convocation by the French president of its Malian partners.
Cyril Payen, you agree this is a gamble that could play in his host's favor?
Well, very much so indeed, and this is what people are saying. The people who dislike the junta, they say this trip is going to legitimize it, because if you come to shake hands and to talk to them, to the very man who is living behind me in the mountain, which is the Assimi Goïta, this is legitimizing him, and so well, it doesn't.
Even if he, sorry, Cyril, even if he
is spreading the surprise,
even if he repeats the same pronouncement we heard in that clip, the French army should not fill the void of the non-functioning of the Malian state.
But why coming here to say that? It really came as a surprise, and I absolutely agree with what have been said before. People quite don't understand why the French president is coming. They really like the forwardness, the way to come in, to try to come for talking, because people expect that he will come to explain things, and especially the next step of Barkhane operation. But to come in Bamako, people really clearly don't understand what he has in his bag and what he has in mind. But as for now, the news spread this morning in Mali, people think that at first, again, it just give a legitimacy and unfair legitimacy to the junta.
You agree, Samuel Romani?
Well, I think that it would probably be a major risk for the French president to certainly visit and meet with Assimi Goïta. Also, because some of the goals that he's going to be achieving are probably going to be pretty elusive, right? I mean, the elections need to be held in February. There's a situation with regards to movement in the pivot towards Russia. France has made it very clear that it would be supporting ECOWAS's efforts to isolate the Malian regime, and also supporting pressure towards a democratic transition. So acknowledging the current authorities would fly in the face of that, and also blur some of the French criticisms of other countries that have been willing to engage with Malian dictatorships like Turkey, Russia, and China. So I think it muddles French policy, and Macron is unlikely to be able to achieve his core objectives when he visits. So I don't think it's going to be very successful.
Michael Shurkin, we heard in that report at the outset, those locals up in Timbuktu saying, look, we live here all year round, so we have to make our separate peace if we have, we have to be pragmatic about where we live right now. And that's what the junta's promised, that there are talks going to be underway. And that's what's infuriated France, particularly in the run-up, again, to a presidential election campaign. The French president has said you don't negotiate with terrorists. Has he talked himself into a corner?
Yes and no. I mean, part of what's going on in terms of the local negotiations are just that. They're local negotiations. It's sort of community by community dealing with local leaders. It's not the kind of community that's got Macron's, the kind of negotiations that have Macron so incensed, which is negotiations with the Ghali or any of the sort of other top tier leaders of the insurgency. And I think also, I mean, the negotiations that are taking place, as far as I know, completely leave the Malian state out of the dark. I mean, in the dark, there's no place for the Malian state in these peace deals. It's basically sort of local level capitulation to local level people. But beyond that, I think I want to reiterate what everybody's saying. Macron's visit is very, I think, dicey for France, and I don't really understand what Macron hopes to achieve unless he feels very confident about his own ability to sort of charm Goita into suddenly shifting his policies. And unfortunately, we've seen lots of evidence to suggest that that's actually the case, that Macron thinks he can pull that off. But beyond that, what I fear is that Macron is searching for sound bites of him talking tough, which would then be able to play well in the election campaign, while Goita himself is searching for sound bites that are going to play well on the Malian street, because he's interested in appeasing the Malian street, and particularly Bamako. And it's been clear that one of the ways that he can shore up his own legitimacy, in the eyes at least of people in Bamako, is by playing this anti-French card. So I think there's a recipe for a real disaster there, with both of them looking to posture simply to play to their own local audiences, and neither of them actually thinking strategically about how to succeed with this campaign against the Islamist insurgencies in Mali.
Nyegere Bakayoko, the stakes here go well beyond the borders of Mali. You have insurgencies, as you were mentioning earlier, in the so-called three borders area with Niger and Burkina Faso. But really, it's all of West Africa, and dare we say all of Africa, that's watching this?
Hopefully not, but the reality is that there is an expansion of these jihadi insurgency, if I may say. We have witnessed it very recently in northern Benin, in northern Togo, serious attacks, even if they were not massive, which are showing that the threat is clearly spreading over. It is also the same in northern Ghana, in northern Côte d'Ivoire, and something we will have to look very carefully is what kind of regimes will be able to deal with this threat. For instance, we can see that Togo is not coping so badly because it is a more authoritarian state. It's not a democracy. And there are also risks to see this security situation to have an unexpected outcome, which will be the spread of more militarism and authoritarianism.
Yeah, we've just had a new president in Niger, Cyril Payen. We have a government that's under pressure in Burkina Faso. These are all countries that have bilateral military agreements with France. The countries that don't have an authoritarian regime, are they in trouble?
Well, this is what it does take. This is how, to come back to the preliminary talks you were mentioning about the parallel with the very, the least we can say, chaotic evacuation of the U.S. Army in Kabul a few months ago. I was there, and at this time, making this parallel with the French reshaping of this own French military in Sahel was not very relevant. Now it looks like very much it is, because if you have in Burkina Faso a very volatile political situation with some rumors of a coup, if you have the Niger, you may say Mohamed Bazoum, which is really now the strongest French ally, but we don't really understand what's going on his borders with respect to what happened to the French military convoy a few weeks ago. It comes like something we could become a trap, and the French military is really aware of that. So it's a risky time, it's very volatile, and maybe it could explain why the French president is taking the risk to come over here, maybe to try to reinvent something. We know that it's going to take some presidents of regional nations, not confirmed yet, but he's maybe trying to make something out of this situation, and maybe to reinvent the French presence, or maybe if he get a wall against him, namely no big conversation, no big breakthrough. Maybe, and this is why he's also running for re-election. He will maybe stop something very sharply about the French military intervention. It looks like many scenarios are possible because we quite don't understand why he's taking so much risks to come over in a few days.
All right, a lot of time between now and Monday. Cyril Payen in Bamako, many thanks. I want to thank as well Samuel Romani in Oxford, Michael Shurkin in Washington, Yagare Bakayoko. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.